Hello, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my amazing interviews. It's been a while since, well, 3 years in fact, since we were all trapped at home when the government deemed it necessary that we stay indoors and avoid going out and meeting people because there was a certain problem with a virus that was floating about that had purportedly come from China. Those 3 years, of course, people have been reflecting about what had happened during that time. Well, today I have an author who has been trawling around, talking to people and capturing those stories that people have lived through during the lockdown and beyond. And it's my very great pleasure to bring Rosanne Gallagher to the show. Rosanne, lovely to have you with me today. I should say that we bumped into each other yesterday. I was giving a talk down in near Weston-super-Mare at Keystoke Village Hall to a packed audience. And you were a member there, and you said, I'm seeing you tomorrow on Zoom. We're going to do a thing. It was very lovely to meet you.
That's right. It was lovely to meet you, Richard, and thank you for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It was great. It was wonderful last night. I said to the other people I was standing with at the time, it's extraordinary because we know Richard so well because so many of us watch you most days of the week, your wonderful monologues and your interviews that are so interesting for us all. And it was as if you just walked off the television set. There you were in your cravat, all ready to go. And we had a fantastic evening. And I have to tell everybody that Rich is not only doing everything that we know he's doing for us, helping us get to know new people, new information during these times, but also we had such an entertaining, funny, interesting, informative evening with you. So thank you very much. And we had a cup of tea in the interval, so it was just great. It was great.
Well, I'll send you the money, of course, for the for all of that. That's very kind of you. I enjoyed it as well, and I do enjoy getting out and meeting people in the flesh, as it were, because it's lovely to do these because we can concentrate and talk about what it is. But it's so nice to meet people in the flesh, and for people also to realise that I am I'm not just a figment on a screen. I am a living, breathing, real man. At least I try to be most of the time. Yes. Anyway, that's not the reason for today's interview, because you have been doing some remarkable work. And you've been collecting stories from people from a huge diversity of people, and you've published some books, and we're going to have a look at those books. They're called Memories of Lockdown. Here we go. Here's one of them that you very generously gave me. In fact, there's the follow-up, and there's another one coming out this year. We'll get into all of that in a moment. But let's just start with your memories of lockdown, where you were, what happened. Mine was very simple, and actually it was very weird being in lockdown because a lot didn't change for me because I was still sitting at home behind a camera doing shows. But for a lot of people it was very, very different, and your books reflect that. But Rosanna, what happened to you then?
Okay, and just briefly, I would just say to you, Richard, the first time I ever met you on screen, as it were, was when you were trawling around Middleton-on-Sea and Felpham, which
blimey,
it's where I grew up.
Oh, was it? And
yes.
Just for the viewers, so that's in West Sussex. I did a series called what did I call it?
The Bald Explorer.
Yeah, the Bald Explorer, and I was doing this series around the border walk. That's right, the border walk, the Sussex border walk, and I was walking around, and Felpham is one of those seaside towns which from me is about, I don't know, 20 miles away, something like that, to the west.
Yeah.
So that's where you were brought up. You're a Sussex girl, are you?
I'm a Sussex girl. I grew up in Middleton-on-Sea, and I went to school in Littlehampton, and so that was all very, very interesting. But my personal memories of lockdown, where was I in the first lockdown? To set the scene, I had been mainly living with my parents in Middleton-on-Sea during the year of 2019. I'd been back and forth over the years, but particularly in that year, my parents needed me. They needed me to look after them, and so I was back and forth, but mainly with them. fast forwarding to when lockdown happened, from one day to the next, I was no longer able to see my father. My mum had sadly died in the November of 2019, and they had jointly decided to sell the family home in Middleton. And so when mum died, I had nowhere to take dad back to, so he had to stay where he was. And it was beautiful, and he was very well looked after, but I could no longer go in to see him every day.
And so that was a care home he was in, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. And so right away they wouldn't let you in.
Right away they wouldn't let me in. Mum and dad had gone in there for 6 weeks for mum to get better and stronger, for them to decide where they wanted to live.
Oh, I see. So he didn't need to be there.
No,
he was just really there to support your mum.
Yes, and then he
was
trapped there.
Yeah, gosh.
So from one day having a cup of tea with him, and of course all those previous weeks I'd been popping in each afternoon. I'd sit with him for a few hours. We'd have tea together, and he'd always want to be watching the news. And that was the first time we were hearing about Wuhan and people dropping dead on the street. So all of that was coming along. And then, as I say, one afternoon I left him, see you tomorrow, Dad. And then I got the call that I could no longer go in and see him. So I took the decision to fly back to my own home in Spain. And that's where I had the first lockdown. And lockdown in Spain was very different from lockdown in England. We were watching all of you with your beautiful weather, if you remember, Richard. You had
I do. I was sitting outside on my step. It was beautiful sunny weather.
Yes.
And you know, where I am on the coast, I was able to walk down to the coast and nip up onto the downs, you know, for the supposed hour that we were meant to have. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, that might have seemed a bit restricting for you, but in Spain we were basically under house arrest. Children were literally under house arrest. They weren't allowed out of their homes for 7 weeks, children.
Now let me just say that during the lockdown for me, I had already built this studio and I was doing entertainment shows, which I was telling you about yesterday in my show, and I had a Spanish correspondent, again an Englishman living in Spain, who was telling us what it was like, and he said he couldn't go out. And in fact, it was either on the second or the third lockdown that he finally, when I say that, our third, fourth lockdown, because I think in Spain you lock down for huge long periods, but there was a time you could go out, and he filmed a tiny bit and smuggled the footage so that we could show people in England what it was like in Spain. And yeah, it was, I just could not believe the restrictions. And he was in a flat and he just couldn't get out. And it was stifling hot weather. What was it like then?
Well, I was very fortunate because we had a nice home with outside space. So I did lots of, walking around the pool and keeping myself going. That was all right. I thought it was shocking. I thought it was terrible. I thought it was unnecessary, but this was very early days. And at that time, I think most of us, and some people had their different views, but I think most of us at that time, we were really trying to fathom out, oh my goodness, what is going on? So we'll stick with things.
And were you getting sorry to interrupt there, were you getting the 3 weeks to flatten the curve narrative?
Only on the English news, which is what I was watching at that time. And you'll see there's a sort of pattern through the book that my wonderful friends and writers who were across the world, all the English people were listening avidly and watching the UK and what was happening in the UK.
Right.
Of course, they were keeping up to date with what was going on with them, but they were very much fixed on that because so many people that live abroad have got all their family back in England.
Yes.
So all of that was going on. We were allowed to nominate one person from each family to do the shopping once a week. If you bought too much, you were considered to be panic shopping.
My goodness, yeah.
If you bought too little, you would be accused by the police, who also sometimes searched people's bags as they shopped. You were accused of not buying enough, and therefore you'd have to be going out again during the week to shop again, which was against the rules. It was horrendous. Every time I went out to shop, every time, I was stopped by armed, masked police who didn't just question me, it was more of an interrogation. Could have been very different, but it wasn't. It was very unpleasant. You got to the supermarket.
It sounds like, you know, those images that we see from the old war films.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, for me, it just slipped back into probably what I imagined Franco days, which, of course, you know, in Spain, it was only 1975 that they came out of the Franco days. So,
right. So
anyway,
yeah.
They
so
slipped
yes, tell us about the supermarket. So what we went to the supermarket and
you went to the supermarket. Everything was lined up: hand sanitizers, plastic gloves, the trolleys all being cleaned all the time. And if you went in, anyway, if you went in and they saw you not doing any of the things you should do, they literally shouted at you. If you stopped and paused next to somebody while you were shopping, somebody would come up and move you along. It was very strict. It was very strict. So
you had plastic gloves, did you, there? Because we did. I don't think we had plastic gloves. You were forced.
You had to take your plastic gloves back off again if you hadn't put your hand sanitizer on, and then your plastic gloves.
Gosh.
So there was some, you know, it was all quite. I thought it was all quite strange, even at that stage. I thought this is ridiculous, because there were logical things that it was like later on when we could see people going out to restaurants and they would wear their masks into the restaurants and then they'd sit down and take them off to eat. Well, whoever possibly ever could have thought that was different, whether you were standing up high or sitting down low. So in Spain, it started like that. It was very, very, very strict. And within about a month of lockdown, in conversation with my adult children, we all agreed that it was time to get out of Spain, because none of us knew what was round the corner. It didn't seem that it was going to stop very soon or very quickly. My thing was always, I spoke to Dad every afternoon. We had lovely long chats, and I just reassured him that as soon as I could get back, as soon as I could see him again, I would get the first plane back. My two local airports, Alicante and Valencia, were both closed. And everybody sort of said, oh, you'll never get out of Spain, you'll never get out of Spain. But I found flights from Barcelona. And so one morning in early June, Joe drove me to the train station in Valencia.
This is in 2020?
This is in 2020, June the 7th, 2020.
Right.
And I left. I didn't know then I was leaving my home forever, of course, but I did. Joe left me to get on the train. I trained up to Barcelona. And then I got a flight back from Barcelona to London. My mind was at rest once I knew Joe was home, because, of course, he wasn't allowed to drive me to Valencia. If he'd got stopped by the police coming home, I was worried about him. And
Joe is your son. We should just point that out.
Joe is my son, who you met last night, Richard.
Yes, so he must have been about 21 at that point.
Yes, I suppose he was 21, 22, something like that, yeah. Anyway, to fast forward, I got the flight home. The lovely, lovely crew on the British Airways flight told me that they had been flying packed aircraft back and forth between England and Spain throughout lockdown. They'd never stopped. So we were all sitting at home thinking all flights were closed and stopped, and that actually wasn't the case.
Oh, right.
So anyway, that was the setting of, that was my first lockdown. Those are my memories. I also had seen during that time on the government website that on the 19th of March on the UK government website, and anybody can go on and see that, they had declared whether they called it the coronavirus, the COVID-19, not a deadly infectious disease. It was no longer declared deadly and infectious on the 19th of March. And yet the world pretty much went into lockdown on the 23rd. So there were little things, big things, that were making me think, this is very strange, what's going on.
Yes.
Anyway.
I mean, certainly a lot of reasons to question it. And the stringent measures in Spain. Now, as I say, my correspondent told me it went on for weeks and weeks. the lockdown, unlike us who had these 3 sort of lockdowns with time off, as it were, for good behaviour.
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, the pictures that we had in the national newspapers of a little old lady being arrested for sitting on a park bench with a cup of coffee just for 5 minutes because she's, you know, elderly and just needed a rest, was nothing to the sort of treatment that was meted out, and that sort of feeling that you had gone back to the 1939-45-44 war.
Yeah.
It's bizarre how, and again, I mean, when you reflect now the way that humans were treating other humans, albeit that some had military costumes on and firearms, I mean, it is weird how that, you know, you stick on the mask, you've got your gun, and suddenly you can treat another human being in an extremely unusual way, in a horrible way. How do you feel about that?
I think it's. I think it was very, very shocking. I think it made me reflect on all the, you know, because my generation, we grew up on watching a lot of war films. I can remember watching war films all through my sort of later childhood with mum and dad, and we'd always be sitting there worrying about this and worrying about that, and how could people behave like that? How could they do that? And my question always to my parents was, how did it ever happen? How did people let that happen in a humane, you know, in that humane sense of things? How did it ever come to that? We'd only come out of a war in 1918, and we were back in another one in 1939. So I always used to think as well of the generation who had, you know, husbands and sons in both of those wars. I mean, horrendous. And and I also heard so very much about the war from my father, who, you know, coming back to my book, I and others had helped him put together a book of his own, which he called Memories of a Different World. In the last 5 years of his life, he got that published, and it was most interesting watching all those war years and seeing how his life had been totally from a teenager caught up with all of that. So then suddenly we are seeing a reflection of, well, we're seeing the same human behaviour.
And yet, you know, you think that we're supposed to have progressed on and learnt from lessons of the past, and yet there we were treating people in that draconian way. Just before we move on to the book, so when you came back to the UK and you got back, were you able then to see your father?
After 2 weeks of being in the UK and isolation, I was then allowed to go and see him.
I forgot about that isolation nonsense.
I know. So I'd flown back, and I was, you know, so desperate to see him. And then they reminded me that I couldn't see him for a couple of weeks. So 2 weeks later, I started being able to see him, I think, once a week.
Right. In person or behind glass?
At that stage, it was summertime, so fortunately, most of the time we were outside, so it wasn't actually behind glass.
Right.
Richard, it was horrendous. You know, Dad was pushed out in a wheelchair and placed somewhere, and we were placed 6 feet apart. And I was listening the other day to, I think it was Pam Gregory in conversation with somebody who was talking about the energy that we individually radiate. If it's good energy, bad energy, whatever it is, radiates 6 feet from us, 6 feet. So when we were isolated by 6 feet, that was, you know, we couldn't feel, even if we couldn't touch each other, neither could we feel each other's energy.
Yes. Almost as if that was planned.
It's very strange, isn't it? It's very curious.
And what happened to Joe then, your son? You said you left Spain, not knowing that you were never going to return, and you left Joe, your 21-year-old son, Were you married? Did you have a partner at that point?
I had a husband at that point,
Right.
who had intended to follow us over. He was part of the plan at that stage. Joe had simply said to me, "Mum, I would like my last summer in Spain."
Yeah.
You know, he had his home, he had his music studio, he had his girlfriend, he had his life.
Right.
And I said, yeah, you know, we'll keep an eye on what's going on. If things start getting a bit difficult, just hop on the next plane back and I'll rely on you to do that. And he just stuck to his word. He said, no, I'll be back by the end of August. So he flew back to England on the 31st of August. Our house in Spain didn't sell, so a very quick story on that. My husband decided to stay, and he stayed on and only actually came back last winter, and he's now living also somewhere in Somerset. So we've all come towards the West Country. Yeah.
So okay, so now you've got this book, and I think one of the things that strikes me just from talking now is how important it is that we remember what happened 3 years ago, because there's always these, it seems to me now, there's this talk, oh, well, there'll be another pandemic anytime soon. You think, hang on a minute, how many times has the world had this big one pandemic and we've all locked down and we've all, actually only the once have we ever had this response. And we're all now thinking, if you do this again, is it a good thing? So it is worth remembering exactly what went on, how people were treated, how frightened they were, what their response was, so that should the powers that be even consider it as an option in the future, that we remember, actually, do you know what? It was such a terrible time for many people. I mean, some people, they managed to renovate their house and improve their garden. But it wasn't the case for everybody, of course. And I think it's very important that it's documented so that people can go, wait a second, is this, because we now have done it and it clearly had a lot of damage for a lot of people, and people can put that forward and say, just a second, you know, the documentation evidence is there. So your book's called Memories of Lockdown, The People's Stories, in 3 parts, and you told me before we started recording that you published them each autumn, and this autumn will be the 3rd of the trilogy.
Yes.
So where did the idea come from, and how did you manage to collect, and I think you're going to read a little bit out from these stories, because they are absolutely, you only gave these to me last night, and I was driving back, so I've only had a glimpse, but even so, they are riveting, because the thing about it is you compare what you did to what other people's experiences in, and some people's experience clearly had a terrible time, and other people a relatively easy time, and you can sort of go, blimey, okay. So where did the idea come from, and how did you find all these remarkable people?
Okay, well, having got through till it would have been June 2021. And all the experiences we'd all had from March 2020 through to June 2021, I realised that I had my own strong opinions, of course, about what was going on. And at that time, I had been sharing them. And I'd realised that actually, if people didn't have the same opinion as me, they weren't interested at all in my opinion. And it was causing a little bit of unhappiness, and I was witnessing huge division between people, friendships, marriages, families falling to pieces. The list goes on and on, but I saw this enormous division, and I decided to take a step back. And I stepped back, and mentally as well, just became more neutral about everything, because I had seen so many different opinions, and I just thought, well, you know, they do all see things differently. They are all speaking their truth. It's not for me to think, just because I feel like this, I'm going to laugh or ridicule somebody who thinks differently to me. So I really started living that, and that felt good. That felt much better than the way I'd been before, of thinking, why isn't everybody thinking like I'm thinking? And
Yeah.
Those things we all go through. So literally one morning in June 21, I woke up and I thought, I'm going to write a book about this. I'm going to write a book, because the other thing we're saying about the importance of capturing these stories is not just that, it's having the written word.
Yes.
The written word, because we have seen, and I don't know whether it's always happened because I've never checked it before, but we've certainly seen over the last few years that the unless it's a written word, it can be changed. So,
Yes.
i.e., if it's just on our computers, if it's just on Wikipedia, somebody who one night went to bed, as the best doctor in the world, or the best virologist in the world, or the most sought after person in his field, the next morning can wake up and find that his description is quite different. He's suddenly that
happened to me when I started talking. I was just an ordinary chap who did the Bald Explorer, wandering around landscape, heritage and nature. And in the next breath, somebody said they booked me for an event, and they said, "Can I just ask you, Richard? I've just looked on Wikipedia. Is it true? Are you a self-confessed racist?" I said, "Pardon? Where did that come from?" He says, "It's on Wikipedia. You're a self-confessed racist." I went to have a look, and actually, by the time I got there, the Wikipedia page had basically sort of said this profile is probably in for editing, is obviously an unreliable person. So a Wikipedia, somebody had set up years ago about my work as a TV entertainer, as an entertainer going around, as a children's author, and all the different things, had been sitting there and no problem at all. And then because I'd raised my head above the parapet and just had my opinion on life, I was now apparently a self-confessed racist. So I reassured this chap that, you can believe it if you wish, if it's on Wikipedia, but I don't class myself as that. So I know exactly what you mean.
Yes.
That anything on the computer, on the internet, can be changed.
Can be changed. It can
in
just
print,
be changed.
It's there.
Exactly.
You've got the written word.
That I just thought it was very, very important to do that. So the idea came to me, and within 24 hours, I had emailed 30 good friends. And I just put my idea to them. I said, I'm going to be collecting memories of lockdown. I think it would be lovely that we can share them. People can read them and understand what other people are going through. So, don't think that person's stupid. Don't laugh at that person.
Yeah.
If they're fearful or they're this or they're that, understand, look, this is their life. That was my aim.
Yeah.
And to my absolute amazement and delight, almost all of them, I think bar two, wrote back immediately and said, yes, I'd love to be part of it. So,
wow.
I was so fortunate to have these good friends who were prepared to, give me their story and trust me to do something fairly decent with it, which is hopefully what I did. Everybody said you'll never get that published. For me at that time, it was important to get it published that autumn, because I wanted it still to be very,
fresh.
very, very relevant.
Yes.
And I did. I found a lovely publisher in Gloucester, the only publisher out of 6 I wrote to who would see me face to face.
Wow.
So again, I drove up actually with Joe. We went up together, and I said to him, do you want to sit in the car? I'll probably be about 20 minutes, half an hour. He said, no, I'll come in with you. And good that he did, because we were in there for 3 hours. She was absolutely wonderful. She was very interested in what I was doing. And so she's published for us. Her publishing house has published my first 2 books. I wanted to self-publish because I wanted my books exactly as I wanted them. I didn't want anybody telling me how it should be.
Right.
I was also very, very lucky because one of the good friends I wrote to for a story, the 2 of them, the couple, are publishers. They are professional publishers, and they're working with books all the time, and they just said, we'll help you. Anything you need, we'll help you. And I did need, and they did help me with the 2 books, and they'll help me with the 3rd one. So that was how it started. And I didn't realize at the time what a fantastic and enjoyable journey it would be, because it reconnected me so strongly with my friends who became writers. And I learnt so much.
But there's more than 30 accounts in your book, so presumably more and more came forward.
Yes, a couple more jumped forward. In the first book, I can remember an old school friend of mine, Jill from Australia, who writes in both books. She introduced me to her niece, who also lives in Australia, Veronica, and she wrote in both books. A couple more people came on board, but I was thrilled and I've loved it, Richard, and I will carry on.
Good for you. So we're going to hear some samples from the book, some of the stories. You're going to read some bits out for us.
I sat down this morning and I thought, I'll just find a few quotes. I'll just put 2 or 3 pieces of paper in here. And of course, I've got about, so I can't possibly read them all to you, but I'll just open it up anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And see what I've got.
And that is the joy. I mean, I haven't had that time, as I said, but I had a look and I've read a couple of stories, and just when you do that, you can just open it up. Some are longer than others, and you can. Whilst you're waiting for the kettle to boil, you could read a simple story, a short story. If you're having a cup of tea or something like that, it's that sort of a book. You haven't got to read it from beginning to end.
Absolutely. And one of the things I wanted more than anything, and the sort of spec, if you can say, that I wrote out to my friends that day was, it doesn't have to be well written. It doesn't have to be the same length story as the next person. It can be between, I actually put 300 and 3,000 words, because that meant they could write a page or 10 pages. If they wrote more than that, it would start taking over the book. So I felt that was kind of reasonable. But I just said to them, I just want your heartfelt stories, and that's what I got. So I've just opened the page here at a lovely young lady who I know in Spain. She's based in Spain, Julia Evans. She's a wonderful artist. And she wrote, this is book 1, she wrote, 2020 was tough, no doubt about it. But in amongst the tough times, we had some amazing times. I have some beautiful family memories from lockdown, and I connected with my loved ones on such a deep level. We are wired to focus and magnify the negative things in our lives. There's nothing wrong with that. We are wired that way for our survival. Once upon a time, a negative thing would have been being eaten by a wild animal. So Julia turned things around for herself, and she actually really enjoyed that first lockdown, because she'd been on the brink of wanting to do something online with her work, and had never had time to do it because she was always so busy in her studio working. She didn't have time to do it. And lockdown gave her that breather. So she writes a beautiful...
And I think a lot of people can also reflect with that. I mean, I heard lots of stories, actually, of people saying, oh, I'm going to take advantages of this and write a book. But they found, actually, because they didn't have anything else to distract them, they didn't get the book written.
Yeah.
And actually, because there was so much time, they would go, well, I can do that later on. I'll do all these things first. The typical sort of writer's excuses.
Yes.
And yet very often it's a busy person who actually then says, well, I'll get up at 5 and I'll just spend an hour every day. And then amazingly, they get a book, 1,000 words comes out, and you go, bloody hell, how do you do that? So I know a lot of people did do that, but a lot of people did get on and utilise that time.
Yeah, they did.
Depending on your motivation.
Absolutely. And she's a very busy girl, and she's got, children, and she had a very busy life. And that's a lovely piece that I've read out there, because that shows her appreciation of what I used to call it, the gift of time.
Yes.
At that time I was grieving for the loss of my mum, and it gave me time to settle back into my home and just have time. I mean, many of us, we just had time that we'd never had before.
And also there was that stillness, wasn't there? Because there was no cars. If you were anywhere like I'm on a relatively busy road. My road, weirdly, of course, where I am, it's a very strange. There's 2 parts to my road, and it's a continuous road, but there's 2 parts to it because I'm quite close to the hospital, so and also very close to a supermarket. So the stretch immediately in front of my house was still relatively busy, as people were going to the supermarket to get food, or people were going to hospital. And very close to me also is the park, and people were going to the park. And if you got to the end of my particular road and went on any other road, they were deserted. And
Yes.
so some people had very quiet experiences, and I was sort of sitting there going, yeah, this is a bit unfair, really, because you're all having all this lovely quiet time, no more cars, no more pollution, and I'm sitting outside in that glorious sun, as you mentioned, going, yeah, it's still non-stop here, you know.
Yes, busy,
So that
busy,
was,
busy.
yeah, it was very odd. Have you got another one to
I
read
have.
out?
Let me find. I'm just going to open up because I've got so many here.
I can imagine.
Let me. Hang on just one moment. I've got a story here from Mark Watson. He was on a Greek island, living on a Greek island with his family. And part of his story, I sat on the internet monitoring what was happening in the rest of the world. I watched with growing horror and some personal trepidation at what was happening in England and the US. I heard from many, it's just the flu, or it's made up, it doesn't exist, and it's a way for them to control us. But I thought, no, concluding from all I saw and read, this is something definitely real, definitely unpleasant. So he goes on, he also talks about how privileged he felt living on that little island, because actually there were no COVID deaths. Yes, a few people got ill.
Right.
I think he, in his story, he says the ships stopped coming in for a while with all the holiday makers. But otherwise, you know.
And of course, remember, we heard those stories of the ships, the cruise ships, that people were getting ill on.
Yes.
And you think of the horror. There you are on a cruise ship, which suddenly becomes a floating prison. You can't get off, and everybody around you is going down with something that had been described as the Black Death, and it must have been terrifying.
Terrifying.
Back in those days.
Yeah.
I'm going to, if I may, read one that I found
Please
this morning.
do.
I'm
Please
just going to
do.
try and quickly find. Here we go. So this is from a gentleman called Graham. And it's the prescription story, which it made me chuckle because it's something that my son had related to me because he worked at A&E during the pandemic. So it's very I could relate to it, and that's the thing that I found looking at your book is you can start to relate it because you know perhaps somebody had a similar thing, but maybe not as bad or a little less, whatever. So this is Graham, and he says this: needing a repeat supply of eye drops. Oh yes, because I've lost an eye. I know what blimmin' eye drops are all about. Needing a repeat supply of eye drops, I took the prescription to the surgery, and not wanting to disturb the rather factious lady in the reception office, I placed my repeat prescription in the box provided. "What are you doing?" came a furious voice behind me. "I'm just putting the prescription in the box as usual," I said. "You can't do that," she bellowed. "Well, it's not a problem," I said. "I've just done it." "Prescriptions don't go in there," she insisted. I think they do," I pointed out. "The sign says, put your prescription in the box." "Well, that was before COVID, obviously," she ranted. "You have to put it in the letterbox outside." "Oh, OK. I'll take it out of the box and go outside and put it in the letterbox." "Well, you can't touch it now. You'll just have to leave it. I'll have to remove it. I'll have to remove it," she said with a furious resignation of someone who had been told that they must scale Everest blindfold. I thanked her profusely and left. And the rest of the story is fascinating to hear more of. The way people were so, she was obviously frightened that anything you touched would have this thing, and you can't do what everybody thought that was normal practice. Everybody went weird. And I relate a story, and I said it last night. Did go for one of my walks in the countryside because we're at the foot of the South Downs here. Yes. And some of the lanes on the South Downs are surrounded by lots of bushes and very narrow paths. And I remember coming across somebody walking the other way, and ordinarily in normal times, you would grant somebody a few pleasantries. "Hello, it's a lovely day, isn't it? Oh, look at the view up here, and can you hear the birds in the sky?" Whatever, and you kind of tend to do that. Well, this other person, he was coming along. He saw me coming down the hill towards him, and he absolutely froze. And I thought, this is very strange. And then he backed like one of those vehicles, this vehicle is reversing. He backed into a hawthorn bush until he was completely enveloped in this thing. And I thought it most extraordinary because he was desperate to get away from me, and because he had his mask on and all that. I didn't have a mask.
Yeah.
And so I stopped and I peered into the bush and went, "Good morning, lovely day, isn't it?" And just I thought the absurdity of it all. Here we were outside in vitamin D.
Yes.
It was a nonsense.
Yes, absolutely crazy. I can remember walking up a high street, and it had arrows on one side of the street. You could go up, and on the other side of the street were there arrows coming down. And I can remember, walking up on the right side, on the side I should be on, and if somebody had made a mistake and was coming down the other way, I can remember people almost jumping under buses rather than walking past you, leaping out into the road. Like, I don't wish to make fun of them. They were obviously that frightened that they thought if they came anywhere near me, they'd rather jump in the road.
Yes. I mean, the mainstream media and the government had done such a job of frightening people. And what I remember when I was doing my Vogue show, which is another channel I have, which is now dormant at the moment, which was an entertainment show that we used to do live shows. And during lockdown, we did them every day, whereas before we'd do them once or twice a week in the evening. We would do them every day. Because what else are you going to do with your life if you're an entertainer? You're going to try and entertain people. And so we were doing these sort of shows, and because on the one hand the audience didn't want to engage with you, some of them, about this subject. You couldn't question anything. That was the other thing, because people were so frightened by it. And I would be regaling, because I was very much critical thinking here, going, hang on a minute, this is not what we normally do in these situations, and how strange it was. But it was interesting, as soon as you started to talk about this, people would log off, they would disappear, people lost friends because you had a difference of opinion. Yes. No one was allowed, and we've seen this so many times, no one was allowed to question what the government or the mainstream media were saying. And it was so frustrating that the journalists were not questioning things like, should we be locking down? They were just asking, should we be locking down more? The presumption was that the science was correct and we should have more extreme measures. And as you know, we've seen Hancock even now sort of going, oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. We should have locked down earlier and locked down more. In your experience of writing these books and talking to these people, presumably you've got a good insight now onto whether lockdown is a good policy overall for dealing with a pandemic.
Well, from what my writers say, they are of very differing opinions. So there are people there that would think that we should have locked down for longer, and there are many that started questioning it along the way. It is even said now, isn't it, publicly, that the lockdowns haven't helped. I've got a funeral director who writes in both the books there, Wesley, and I think it's in book 1 he talks about the number of suicides of young men, not women, young men in 2020, the suicides. And I think that so much has now been recognised of the horrors that lockdown has inflicted. Because it wasn't just, some people were lucky they had their family there.
Yeah.
Some people were completely on their own. Think of the elderly people. I mean, the whole thing is an absolute nightmare. So going from my writers, we have differing opinions.
Right. Well, I mean, what's the demographic of your writers, would you say? Are they are they middle class? Were they people who had their own houses and gardens?
Yes, mostly.
Right.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you take the perspective of people who were living in flats with 3 kids, who ordinarily parents would both be at work, the kids would be at school, they're not home very much in, 2 or 3 raised flats, that sort of switch, of which the UK is full of, and a lot of depraved areas, a lot of poor people, a lot of people who, have never really had to stay in the same confined space for very long. And then the park might be a walk away. If people are living in cities, as a lot of people, of course, are, or big towns, and the park might be a bit of a journey where you can't just sort of let the kids out anymore. I mean, for me, the notion that there were people trapped in very hot weather like that, and the amount of child abuse, of course, that we know went on. And I think it has been recognised that actually lockdowns as a preventative method was far worse than the perceived virus in and of itself. Of course, if you had the luxury of a big garden and a house in the countryside, or those sort of things, not so bad. But if you've got to work, and your wife is at home or your husband is at home dealing with kids, and they're not used to it, and the kids are crying and they need nappies and they need this and that, and they want to see their friends, and school is not letting them in. I mean, it's
nightmare. Absolute nightmare. I mean,
intolerable.
I used to think during lockdown, here I am during that first lockdown in Spain. Here I am. I'm very lucky I've got outside space. And then thinking of all the people, as you've just described, who were shut into, small areas with people that perhaps they actually didn't want to be spending time with anyway.
Well, I can imagine that many marriages broke up, and all sorts of, because people just are not used to being that clamped together. And why would you? Because it's so artificial. It's prison.
Yeah.
It's prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
By any other name.
And then you add on to that the horror of being locked in somewhere with your abuser.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean,
horrendous.
The thing is, it doesn't bear thinking about, but one's got to think about it. And I think this is where this sort of work, and I have heard other people are doing similar things, and more of it needs to be done, in which we record, as you say, in print that can't be changed, and so that is there for future generations, and even to remind us if things like the pandemic treaty, that the WHO would like to have our sovereignty so that they can tell us what the response will be. If there's another pandemic, actually we will lock you down and we will mandate some sort of medical treatment for you, that we, the sovereign people of this country, are able to say, actually, do you know what? We went through that. We know what it's like. It didn't work. We're not having it. It might have worked for some people, but for the vast majority, it was worse than the virus itself. Well done you for doing this. The third one will be out this year, I gather.
Yes, I'm working on that now, so I'll be going into editing in September. And again, there are some writers that have written all the way through, and they'll continue their story in the third book. Some new writers have come on board, and it will publish before Christmas. And then I'll have to see where I go from there. Be very interesting, but I shall continue because we want to keep these records. I think it's very important.
I think it's very, very important. So the publisher is the Choir Press.
Yes.
I can see that on the back. You're Rosanne Gallagher, and the book is called Memories of Lockdown, and it's available in all good bookshops and online.
It's not available in all good bookshops, and it's available through my website.
Right, okay.
It's available through Amazon, and the publisher dealt with that side of things, Richard. I wasn't very sure. I hadn't got a clue what I was doing, quite frankly.
Right.
And she just said, it will go out to certain bookshops and one thing and another. But through my website is great, because then I can give a bit of a discount when people are buying two and one thing and another. And some people perhaps will wait and buy the three together, and then I'll do something special on that. I
assume that if you nip down to your local bookshop, because it's been published properly, they could order it.
Yes. But
it might be quicker through your website. Yes. And as you say, you'll be prepared to give a discount, what have you, and even sign them, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Which you very kindly did to the lovely Julia and myself.
I did.
On the ones that you gave me. So
thank
you very much for that.
No, that's a
and it was lovely to meet you in person yesterday at the talk. I'm doing some more of those, and people keep asking me would I come to various places, which I'm more than happy to do.
Yeah.
So what's the website address so that I can put that up? I'll also put it in the description.
The website is www.memoriesoflockdown.com.
Oh, right. Brilliant.
That's it.
So memoriesoflockdown.com.
Yeah,
Nice
and in
and
there
easy.
is my contact details and all of that. And I shall see you, even if it's just to wave to you, on Sunday, because you're coming up to Glastonbury, aren't you, again?
Yes, that's right. I should be at the Glastonbury Symposium.
Yeah, fantastic.
But in the meantime, Rosanne, well done. Thank you so much for telling us about it. It's very important work that we do remember these things, because it's a history that is so unique.
Yes.
You know, like the First World War and those men that went over the troops and the women that lost all those sweethearts, and the nation that lost their men folk. And then the Second World War, again, unique for us in Blighty, especially down on the south coast, being for the first time on the front line as civilians with planes bombing us. This was another type of war, whether it's a virus or something else. It was a unique experience to be told by a government and the mainstream media to stay at home and do the right thing, and then they wouldn't see you in the hospital. I mean, I cannot think of anything quite so awful that people would do willingly to each other through a fear policy.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Anyway.
And it was a fear policy. It was the government, the media, 24/7. I mean, I stopped watching the television a long time ago, but I keep up to date with everything. But what I do now is I don't get immersed in it, because actually we've got a wonderful future ahead of us. And for those of us that, we've got choices, haven't we, basically?
Yes.
We've got choices.
I think we have. And the thing is, if anything, it did tell us that perhaps authority, not all the time, gets it right. And authority doesn't always tell us the truth. And mainstream media doesn't always benefit us. No. And if people just take that as what we've gone through in the past and think again about, actually, maybe I do. They say that they are the ones where all the facts are being checked. But clearly during that period, I think a lot of people will have said, well, I believed it all, but I'm not sure it was actually true or relevant or the right thing to do now. Yeah. And should anything happen in the future and the government start telling us and dictating us what we should do, perhaps the best thing is to question everything and use a bit of critical thinking. Rosanne, lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And don't forget to get the book, Memories of Lockdown, memoriesoflockdown.com. Get the discount, get all 3 books, get them at Christmas, all of that. And I will be back, of course, with more monologues and more of my lovely interviews in due course. But from Rosanne and myself, thanks for watching. Till next time, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.